I just want to thank you all for sharing space and being here with me this evening. I know it's the tail end of a busy semester, so it means a lot. And I'd also like just to take a moment and extend thanks to the college for their invitation to share a bit more about my work and to be one of the fall speakers for the Center for the Study of Childhood Arts Speaker Series. So my goals tonight are really twofold. First, I do think it's important to provide some background on who I am, both as an educational researcher, a scholar, anti-racist teacher, educator. It's also necessary that I tell you a little bit about who I am as a person. If we've never met, or this is the only time that we'll share together during my visit at Arkansas, I hope you walk away with a better understanding of my passions, commitments, and general understandings of what drives my work. My second goal, as you'll see, is to share snapshots, some sonic scenes, if you will, from an empirical project examining young children's artistic play with sound and the practice of the field recording. I'll talk across the genesis of this larger project and then go into more detail, not only about my interest in sound and sonic technologies, but how I see the communicative mode serving as a ripe site for continued inquiry in studies of childhood art. But as Chris said, I am a kindergarten teacher, so I want to start with a story. It's a recent picture book that's become one of my absolute favorites. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Matt de la Peña's Milo Imagines the World traces child protagonist Milo, who you see here, and his sister travel on the train to visit their mother, who's incarcerated. During the ride, as Milo's sister snaps selfies and plays on her phone, Milo studies the other passengers and draws them, speculating possible futures and alternative realities with his pencils. Although the text is largely understood to be one that advances conversations concerning how bias can stunt or shape our understanding of others. For instance, here, Milo sees a young white child in a suit get on the train, imagines him in the picture book to be royalty, and only later finds out that he too is visiting an incarcerated parent. I want to use the book to illustrate my interest and commitments to leveraging children's and young people's ingenuity and innovation. Whether understood here through a technology like Milo's pencil, or with a story like de la Peña's picture book, these, as I will underscore, are ripe sites to serve as arts learning. So as an educational researcher who attends closely to qualitative modes of inquiry, I engage in participatory, ethnographic, and arts-based methodologies to examine how media and technology mediates children's and youth social and civic action. Whereas earlier work of mine has interrogated how these technologies have facilitated the development of minoritized young people's imagined social futures, my work more broadly has consistently asked what this may mean for broader cultural and community change. As a teacher educator and someone who works quite closely with practitioners, I also hold an axiological commitment echoed here in your college's mission statement. I see my teaching and research advancing a redistributive, recognitive, and representative social justice. And this starts from a premise that is promoting schooling as a good towards the betterment of the social world. Similarly, my scholarly profile is anchored in what Eve Tuck would call a desire-centered perspective. I'm concerned with understanding the complexity, contradiction, and self-determination of minoritized children, youth, and youth communities as they come to intersect with facets of teaching, learning, and the design of schooling writ large. So my goal with tonight's talk, Sculpting the City Through Sound, Reading Young Children's Miraculous Adventures as an Arts Encounter event, is not to provide exhaustive remarks about sound as a mode or a material for children's expression. Indeed, that would be a nearly impossible feat, and one that I do not feel equipped or qualified to talk about. But instead, I want to use the time together to rethink how sound as a technology and the field recording as a practice may reconstitute the sensory archive of young children's engagement with the arts. So the work I'm presenting here tonight comes from a larger, multi-sided study examining young children's making. In 2016, I was approached by Dr. Jackie Marsh, who you see here of the University of Sheffield, to be a co-PI to a grant-funded network of early educators. A European Commission Age 2020 program, MAKI, or Making in the Early Years, fostered a collaborative of educational researchers across the globe to research the role of digital technologies and the potential of community makerspaces in the learning of young children. So civic making, my part of the US contingent's inquiry, was situated at the nexus of three larger problem spaces: early civics education, equity in making and young children's digital design, and critical literacies research. So from 2016 to 19, I worked across three very diverse contexts: a public multi-age classroom in the Midwestern United States, Thompson Elementary, a parochial pre-K3 classroom in Northeast Massachusetts, the St. John's School, and a two-way primary grades language immersion program in the South End of Boston, which I call the Williams School. Today I'm going to focus on one of those contexts, the Williams School, and I'll also introduce you to three participants and child sound artists: Ford, Kevin, and Gordy. So making, conceptually and in the project, was conceived of as a form of worlding, wherein young children leverage materiality to consider possible futures as concepts to think with. At the Williams School in Boston, unlike other spaces I worked in, making became very school-oriented. It was structured, placed during a very routinized instructional block, and was largely driven by the teachers that I worked alongside of, Miss Steele and Miss Flowers. Although we initially collaborated, forming a project-based unit around the compelling question, how do community members make a difference, making quickly evaporated into the want for children to construct similar arts. I'll use, those are the teacher's words, not my own artifacts, like the recycle poster you see here. The space for student autonomy was really sparse, and creative design happened in small staccato moments where the teachers were not leading and we were playing under the teacher's radar. I provide you with this context as the resulting student-produced artifacts that I'll talk about tonight were quite different. Whereas the larger project-based inquiry was instructionally staged by hearing how a local community organizing group that you see here on the smartboard, the Ramsey Park Collective, engaged in civic activism to reopen a community space, the initial instructional sessions were aimed to have students describe individual understandings of civic responsibility. So comparatively, sessions in supporting question 2 were interested in zeroing out from the personal in order to develop students' understanding of their role in the greater Boston community. So in its enactment, this part of the children's inquiry commenced with a read aloud, Rachel Isadora's book, Listen to the City. Through figurative language and onomatopoeia, students quickly heard the swish, swish, swish of the city street sweeper, or the ring, ring, ring of a neighbor's doorbell. Following the read aloud, teachers worked with students to brainstorm possible soundings of their own local neighborhood. So for the purposes of this talk, I want to fast forward to the sound walk itself. Alongside my research team, we were very brave. We outfitted 8 7-year-olds and their 2 teachers with GoPros. I stayed back and watched the development of the walk on my iPhone as it streamed video from the journey itself. Concurrently, I mapped the directions and intervals for stopping on Google Maps. After the walk, the teachers and our team reviewed some of the children's videos to make connections the next day. So although in some of my previous work, I've used these recordings to highlight the consequential problem of community sounding different for some children, noting how sounds are textured by race and class differences, today I want to take a detour from the descriptive and examine this B-roll of generated data. So in so doing, I want us to think about the GoPro that you see here, not solely as a visual technology, rendering first-person perspectives of the walk itself, but one whose sonic capacity widens its register as a medium for sound art production. So taking this idea forward, these are the questions guiding my inquiry. How do 3 young children sculpt the city through sound? What, according to these 3 auditors, are the acoustic signatures of their community? And then reading young children's field recordings as expressions of sound art, how might we understand these oraculous adventures with the sonic as an arts encounter event? So what is a field recording? Like celebrated field recorder David Tagomi, I see the field recording as, quote, concerned with a certain predisposition or openness to the field and its exploration or relation. In other words, a field recording is a growth process. It is a sonic encounter and exchange. The recording requires a perceptive sensibility that connects its making to some social implication. So in short, and following Kathy Lane's account, another field recorder featured in this text, the field recording is, quote, a creative way of interacting with reality rather than representing reality. Field recordings serve as material documents, mutating meanings rather than ossifying them. So the use of the GoPro camera, primarily recognized as a visual technology, may seem like a strange tool for generating field recordings as a focus on phonography, unlike photography, is more varied and complex. But I see it as a unique medium for capturing children's heard phenomenological fields. Improvisational and provisional, the GoPro also captures sonorous qualities or sound. And as a tool, it not only gestures towards the texture of sound, but provides insight into its current character and movement. Relatively symbologenic in its heard form, our focus on the field recording will center on biophony, or sounds of the living world, as well as anthrophony, or sounds associated with the human. So understanding the field recording as an arts practice requires a working definition for us of what sound art is. So like sound studies scholar and artist David Lubell, I understand sound art as, quote, a range of practices that search for a means to live side by side with the foreign, the strange, and the unknown. Sound art often marks an ontological distinction between work that employs the sonic and work that examines its conditions of possibility. Driven by a general interest and engagement with experiences of intensity, of finding place by confronting alien energies and deepening our listening sense precisely when it is most difficult, sound art, according to Lubell, brings us into intimate contact with such intensities, bringing often sharp boundaries between not only musical language and environmental sound, but equally between myself and another, between the human figure and the species, between the seen and the unseen, to produce dramatic experiences of embodied and affective sounding. Sound, as a form, can be sculpted. Through its size, dimension, viscosities, textures, and affects, it becomes physical material. So sound, materially, technically, and symbolically, provides auditors or hearers with a relatively inconsistent frame of intelligibility. So thus, in this work, I'm theorizing children's field recordings as what Grisella Pollock calls an arts encounter event. This perspective sees the interpretation of art as a collaborative act solicited by the artwork. As Pollock writes, theorizing art as an encounter event sheds light on its mediation between subjective sites of production, circulation, and consumption, precipitating a potentially transformative encounter with difference. What Pollock suggests here is that the goal of interpretation should not be to ask what art is about, a project leading back to the artistic subject to whom it is thought to originate, but rather to ask what is this artistic practice doing, and where as well as when that doing occurs. So in other words, to ask what are art's occasions and temporalities. And in this way, reception is not ready-made. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data generation of the broader project. It occurred both in the spring and fall semesters of 2018. Detailed field notes of weekly interactions with children were kept. It was divided among the research team. We sought to inhabit the classroom space in the Williams for an average of 3 full days a week. Given the age of participants, 7 and 8, we would often perform what Bridget Dalton calls design interviews in the moment with children. These interviews focused on the elements and purpose of collaboratively produced arts artifacts. These artifacts included child-produced drawings and photographs, field recordings, as well as completed analog and digital projects. So the interviews ranged from about 3 to 17 minutes and covered categories and questions such as the description of the artifact, the procedural narrative of the design process, as well as what it meant to make a difference through making, or what was the value of the project, and how did this artifact project possible futures for or about their community. Outside of these design interviews and data that I'll draw on tonight were whole group and centers discussions with the children. So reading across participant-produced artifacts and transcripts of design interviews, we first conducted a thematic analysis across the larger textual corpus. This was useful for identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns within themes of children's talk. These initial themes included collaborative engagement and joint production in making, personal histories of participation as impetus for designing possible futures, and then tensions or dissonance in the co-production of sonic art and making. So organized by key focal moments, moments where sound was mobilized through field recordings, I then did a second pass through the data, and with the help of this conceptual frame of the arts encounter event, I worked to make sense of the relationship between children's motivation to mobilize sonic design and play with the field recordings as a means of sort of relational witnessing. So as a former early grades educator, I find it necessary just to pause here a little bit and talk about myself as someone who's an able-bodied adult auditor and an educator. In other words, to ask, how am I in relation both with the human and more than human encounters that emerge through and with the sonic? So when working with young children's sound art, I adopt what Mark Peter Wright has called a listening with approach to the field recording. It, as Wright suggests, is a method and mode of attenuating that fosters critical alliance with the sounds I hear or do not hear rather than approach them, both the product and the child, as something to listen to or for. Listening with, as a stance, asserts that there is no singular subject, but instead a plethora of ears, bodies, perspectives, recordings, and mediations at stake. As an early childhood educator, this stance comes relatively naturally as I've continuously sought to mobilize what Davies has named as emergent listening as a pedagogical stance, a form of listening that involves working to some extent against oneself. In other words, to resist the adult impulse that we may have to listen as usual and reiterate what is already known. Nonetheless, as an adult, I recognize that my attempt to describe and insistence on interrogating the work for meaning flattens the vibrancy, materiality, and animation of the sonic. So as such, I'm going to present sounds here tonight on their own, often leaving scenes and tracks with questions the children asked and offered, while I unsuccessfully perhaps still search for meaning. So I'm going to provide another caveat here and say that the examples of young children's sound art I'm going to present are not the most interesting per se, nor do they show the range of sonic practices known under the umbrella of what sound art is, like sonification. But nonetheless, the tracks I will share provide an illustrative backdrop to the sounds of young children's arts making. Young children, both individually and collaboratively, mobilize the field recording as a form of sounding community. Making allowed students to not only design preferable futures, but to react to personal precarities of the present. Although limited in the scope here, each track provides a glimpse into the promises and pitfalls of young children sculpting the city through sound. They are what Espinoza and Vasugi would name as, quote, grasshopper-scale fragments of the future, alive in the present. Track 1.
Well, we're getting really close to school, so like, oh my gosh, where's Gutierrez? Wow. Ben, you just made wall cycling in the way for the kids. Oh, it's time to get picked up. Wait, what you said? It's time to get picked up.
So in total, our walking field trip took about 2 hours. During this time, the teachers and children stopped at area murals like the one you see here, listened to the city's ambient sounds, and took a pit stop at a playground to wash away some mid-walk wiggles. Kevin, whose first-person GoPro perspective we witnessed at the top of the track, and Gordy, the white child in the frame next to him, were quite excited to return to the GoPro video at the sound station, a center we had had up. "Remember when Miss Gutierrez kicked the recycling?" Gordy exclaimed. "Oh yeah," Kevin replied. "I think I filmed it. I want that to be my sounds." So looking across the last 6 minutes of Kevin's video, the next day at Centers, we came back and cut the scene where Kevin captured the kick and Gordy gasped, "Miss Gutierrez!" Focusing on the sound, I asked if we could put on headphones and listen to the audio without the video. Can I draw what I want it to sound like, Gordy asked. Quickly, he began sketching. Concurrently, I worked with Kevin to cut the 6 minutes into an even shorter 1-minute clip, trimming the video to cut off right after Gordy said, "It's time to get picked up." So Gordy's visual illustration provides a relatively accurate rendering of the scene. Wednesday, the day of the walk, is recycling day in South Boston. As such, the streets were littered with sidewalks with their bags and other receptacles waiting for recycling to be picked up. Ms. Gutierrez, one of the paraprofessionals who joined us on the walk, is walking on the sidewalk and kicks a bag. We audibly hear this in the video. Working to mark the sounds in this visual representation, we see Gordy write kick and boom on the illustration. "It's like listen to our city," he replied when asked about the onomatopoeias. "Mr. John," Kevin carefully asked, "but how do we show those words with the sounds?" So after the weekend, I returned to the Williams the following Friday, and I swapped the SoundStation Chromebook for my personal laptop. Together, I asked Kevin and Gordy what they wanted the kick and the boom to sound like. "Like, can you just play it over and over?" Gordy asked. "What do you mean?" I answered. "Just play this over and over and over," and Kevin demanded, "No, don't do that." And then Gordy says, "Oh, it's a loop. That's what it's called, a loop, loop it." Interested in how they might visually understand GarageBand, a relatively easy-to-use sound manipulation software on iPads, I cut the kick and the "oh my gosh, Ms. Gutierrez" sounds, and I asked them, "Do you want to play these over and over?" So opening up the file on their classroom iPads, I handed over the GarageBand app with the audio file and the single track underneath it to the boys. They worked diligently to split their headphones and copy and paste their way in their own words to make it the soundtrack of the picture.
Well, we're getting really close to school, so oh my gosh, Miss Gutierrez. Wow. Oh my gosh, Miss Gutierrez. Wow. Oh my gosh, Miss Gutierrez. Wow. Man, please shoot left. Oh my gosh, Miss. Oh my gosh, Miss Gutierrez. Wait, what you said? It's time to get picked up.
So as with all design interviews, I interviewed Gordy and Kevin about what their sonic manipulation, as I was interested in marking the resonances they wanted listeners to witness. In other words, I sought to interrogate what Wright has called the recorder's ear view. So I asked, was it easy to copy and paste? And Kevin said, "Oh, well, we shortened it too." And I said, "What?" "He means this," and he pointed to the clip where you can we used our thumbs to squish that sound so you can keep hearing the kick because of the picture. And I said, "Oh." And then Kevin says, "But we let the whole thing play sound." "What?" And Gordy says, "The song." And Kevin says, "He means the sound." And Gordy says, "Well, it is sort of like a song, right?" So like with most artifacts from our project, Ms. Flowers and Ms. Steele were curious to have the children show off their work during the chair circle, an end-of-day ritual wherein students were asked to show their learning. The following is a brief excerpt of that recorded exchange. So Kevin sets this up and says, "So this is the end of the walk." And Ms. Steele asks, "Oh, and when we were walking back?" And Kevin replies, "And when we were walking back, we saw Ms. Gutierrez kick the recycling." And Ms. Steele reframes his question and says, "Did she kick it, or did she move it out of the way?" And Gordy giggles and he says, "She kicked it." And Ms. Steele says, "I don't think she kicked it. You can play the sound, Kevin." Gordy responds, "It's actually a song." And Kevin says, "The Miss Gutierrez song." So after the clip played, Ms. Steele quickly dismissed the work, noting how, according to her listening, she thought the two were poking fun at Miss Gutierrez. The other children, however, loved it. They wanted to know how they did it with their iPads and yearned to have Gordy and Kevin come over to create soundscapes from their walk and their GoPros. Yahira even asked, "Can I take the GoPro home, John?" So at the end of the day, we hear bus, bodega, walkers away. That very much sort of set, it was time to go home. And Miss Steele yelled this. We all packed up, and as I was zipping up Kevin's coat, he whispers to me the following. I don't know why she was mad. These were just the sounds, like the real sounds from the walk, not made up sounds. They were real. Track 2. So our project and the work at the Williams School was quickly cut, given the time constraints on the teachers and the perception that my team and I were just, quote, letting them play. Ms. Steele was going on maternity leave at the end of the month, and in the closing weeks of November and December, we were, as you heard, primarily spent rehearsing for the winter holiday choir show, or with the children painting individual additions to a community mural, the only school-sanctioned teacher-approved arts artifact we were able to usher through from start to finish. During center's time, Ford, an otherwise absent white child in our larger project, was adamant about wearing the GoPro to record what he called the sounds of Spanish. Perhaps because this was done on a day when the classroom was marked as English only, we took his invitation, suited him up with a GoPro and a head harness, and watched as he recorded himself and his classmates sing. You actually may have heard Ford. He's the one that said, ho, ho, ho. The next day, Ford came to the sound station that you see here and asked to watch his video. With our suggestion, and because now many of the other children in the class were circled around us also watching, we turned the video off, handed Ford earphones, and collectively listened to the recording instead. Below is a transcript of our conversation after that listening. So why did you want to record this? Just for fun, or do you think it fits with the work we've done? Like, is this what community sounds like? You see me, like, it's me trying to make sense of what's going on. And Ford says, yes. And I say, okay, we'll say more. And Ford says, on our walk, like, everyone was speaking Spanish. Miss Yolanda, Miss Steele, the neighbors. But then when we get to the class, there are some days where we only speak English, like yesterday. Yes, I say, red days and green days are for Spanish. And Ford says, yes, and I speak English. And I say, well, Ford, you speak Spanish too. And Ford says, but like my mom speaks English, my sister speaks English, I only speak Spanish at school. And I say, okay. And Ford responds, Spanish is the sound of the Williams. No, Spanish is the sound of the city. Isn't that weird, he asks. And I say, what is? And he says, like, it's the sound of the city, but I only speak it at school. So I was curious to learn more about Ford's sort of take of hearing Spanish at the Williams, and we invited Ford to share his final recording, although his teachers before asked him to add a picture. He subverts this request with an abstract expression. So we are sitting together on the carpet, and with the teacher's encouragement to use similar sentence frames to the visual thinking strategies that we saw practiced at the Williams, we listened together to the recording. After, Ford, using prompts that his teachers provided, asked his classmates the following. What is going on? What do you hear that makes you say that? What more information do you need? Very quickly, hands shot up in the air. Friends, said Yahira. Okay, Miss Steele started, but what makes you say that? What do you hear? Luz says, lots of us singing. But what's with the picture, Miss Flowers, the other first grade teacher asked. Ford smiled. It didn't really need a picture story. I just wanted people to hear what I was trying to do. The picture's actually a distraction. I was just distracting people. So Miss Flowers insisted, what were you trying to do? And Ford replies, I guess I don't know. So watching him feel relatively defeated about his sonic work, Miss Melita, a graduate student research assistant and community artist who helped support our project, we followed Ford out of the classroom and into the hallway as he put on his coat, and he also got ready to go home. Miss Melita, with the pencil drawing in her hand, said, I love it, Ford. It's so abstract and the line work is really good. Ford smiled, zipping up his jacket, and said, thanks. Does it go with the recording, or, I asked, and Ford cut me off. No, the drawing isn't important. Ford doubled down. The songs and sounds were what I was trying to have people hear. Well, I cautiously started, and you told us what you wanted us to hear, so that was helpful. But he asked, what do you hear? If I didn't tell you what I think it was, what do you think it means? What would you have heard? So what? What do these two tracks, like impartial, fragmentary, and incomplete, teach us about sound, sonic technologies, and children's capacity as sound art producers? So sound, as I want to suggest here, transforms the cartography of the perceptible, the thinkable, and the feasible into what Jacques Rancière introduces as, quote, a multiplicity of folds and gaps in the fabric of common experience. Examining the role of the sonic in what he calls the distribution of the sensible and social space, sound, for these three children, was a means of altering that distribution. As we heard, children's field recordings presented complex palettes of both possible and plural meanings. Indeed, as track 1 and track 2 highlight, sound, as Cordy, Kevin, and Ford showed us, has a politics. It's environmentally shaped, anthropogenically felt, thinking about the recycling, and helps us hear the human and more than human in new ways. As a resource for artistic production and circulation, the sonic harnessed, described, analyzed, performed, and interrogated the conditions of multimodal composition, play, and the processes by which early arts learning operated. These questions of playful production led to new encounters of sonic reception. What do we, as children, sound like? How are we heard? How can I, as a child, communicate that I care? What do you, as the adult, hear? So across these two scenes, we've seen how sound as matter matters. Indeed, in all of these tracks, the field recording amplifies an epistemology and ontology of indeterminacy. Whether refracted through young children's natural soundings or heard through the echoes of a revised field recording that shifts the tenor or the register of feeling, sound has this very ephemeral physicality. So if the field recording can be summarized as an exploration of the acoustic worlds of humans and non-humans through the capture, construction, and mediation of sound, then these three young auditors ensured that our interpretation of the aural field, that which we as adult listeners heard, was not an intersubjective state, a space where many of us probably carried an ear of suspicion, asking the question, what am I not hearing? If you're interested or want greater sort of clarity around the project, I'd be more than happy to chat during Q&A, or feel free to follow up after the talk to email me, because there's a lot obviously here that's hidden. But to close, I want to argue that sound art, as I tried to illustrate with this examination of young children's field recordings, nurtures imaginative solidarities. This, I believe, is the power of the medium. Sound art often tunes us to what we cannot see and what is charged chiefly by unknown or unknowable phenomena, as well as the urgency and desire to construct a space for deeper attention. In other words, listening becomes this superimposition. It's always multiple, always more than, always sort of a construction of sights, stretched and on the move, reiterating and building rather than residing as the static object that's capable of a single meaning. That's sort of the paradox of the field recording. While it enables audiences to inhabit the interior of the form. For instance, the there and the then of the Christmas concert or the listening walk. It sort of collapses this distinction between subject and object, a dislocation of the oral topography of our own sense-making. And as your own sort of Chris Schulte writes, these shapes and forms of art's practice, quote, work against the feeling that we ought to know and that we can know the child's creation. So what I propose here and now is a more integrated or sound approach to examining making, learning, and playing with arts technology. One that attempts to bracket off the senses and silences noise for one that is both inclusive of and responsive towards the sonic. As educators, I encourage us to examine the complex vibrations that exist and ask how we might, as educators or researchers, continue to explore the complex interplay that exists between modes, methods, materials, and technologies to think, make, play, and learn with. So with that, I'll sort of end with this Blair Witch Project video again, but sort of I look forward to any of the questions and answers you have or things that you may sort of just be curious about the larger project. So thank you.